Most people think an economy breaks where the cameras are pointed. They think it breaks in the stock market. They think it breaks in a bank failure dramatic enough to make television anchors lower their voice and straighten their posture. They think it breaks when some politician says a sentence so foolish or so reckless that the market drops 600 points before lunch. That is how ordinary people imagine financial trouble. It is understandable. The loud parts are easier to see, but the loud parts usually arrive later. The real break often begins somewhere quieter. It begins in the household, it begins in the kitchen, it begins with a family sitting at a table looking at numbers that used to fit and no longer fit. It begins when a couple with decent jobs, decent habits, and no obvious wildness realizes that the emergency is no longer theoretical. The emergency is this month. That is where I would tell you to look if you want to know whether the American consumer is healthy. Not at slogans, not at campaign speeches, not at official smiles. Look at behavior under pressure. What is the household actually doing now that it would not have done in easier years? What assets is it pulling from? What debts is it adding? What payments is it missing? What future promises is it raiding in order to survive the present? That is where the truth lives. And the truth, from what I see, is not cheerful. I do not say that because I enjoy gloom. I have never liked theatrical pessimism any more than theatrical optimism. I like numbers. I like structure. I like watching what people do when conditions stop flattering them. And what I see now is not the profile of a thriving consumer. It is the profile of a stretched consumer. A consumer still standing, still spending in many cases, still showing up, but doing so with more strain, more debt, more leakage, and less honest room than the headlines suggest. I have said many times that the American consumer is a remarkably powerful force. Consumer spending makes up an enormous share of the economy. If the household is strong, the country can withstand a great deal. If the household is weak, the country can sound healthy on paper for a while and still be moving toward a harsher reckoning underneath. That distinction matters. You can have strong slogans and weak families at the same time. You can have low official unemployment and rising private fear at the same time. You can have respectable inflation statistics and still have millions of people quietly discovering that the monthly cost of existing has outrun the monthly power of their paycheck. That is not a contradiction. It is modern economic life. One of the clearest warning signs is what people do with retirement money. A retirement account is not supposed to be ordinary spending cash. It is not a checking account with a patriotic label. It is a promise from your present self to your future self. When people begin rating that promise in unusual numbers, that is not an administrative detail, that is distress talking. A household does not take a hardship withdrawal from a retirement plan because life is going splendidly. It does it because the present is pressing hard enough that the future must be sold for parts. And that is exactly what seems to be happening more often. People are taking money out to avoid foreclosure or eviction. Think about that. Not to buy some silly luxury item, not to fund a vanity project to avoid losing shelter. Others are taking it out for medical expenses, others for tuition, others for home repairs. These are not signs of a nation casually prosperous enough to drift upward on momentum. These are signs of a nation where ordinary obligations are now powerful enough to invade what used to be guarded territory. That matters because the damage is twofold. The person solving today's emergency is not only using the money, he is also removing decades of future compounding. A dollar taken out of a retirement account in midlife is not just a dollar spent. It is the future value of that dollar surrendered. It is later peace sacrificed to present necessity. Now, I am not cruel about this. If you need the money, you need the money. Life is not a clean spreadsheet. Children get sick. Homes break. Jobs disappear. Landlords still want rent. The point is not to scold people already under pressure. The point is to understand what the behavior is telling us. And it is telling us something simple. The consumer does not have enough margin. Margin is one of the most underrated words in finance. Margin is not merely a concept for brokers and speculators. It is the distance between a normal inconvenience and a real emergency. A household with margin can absorb a bad month without tearing open the future. A household without margin cannot. So when hardship withdrawals hit record highs, what I hear is not a quirky retirement statistic. What I hear is that the distance between daily life and financial distress has become too small for too many people. The same truth appears in another place people do not talk about enough. Older Americans going back to work. People use pleasant language for it. Now they call it unretiring. A cute modern phrase can make a hard reality sound almost whimsical. But a lot of the time this is not whimsy, it is necessity. If an older person returns to work because he is bored and wants to stay active, fine. There is dignity in activity. But if he returns because the numbers no longer support the retirement he thought he had earned, that is not a lifestyle preference. That is a financial verdict. It means the system did not produce enough cushion. It means inflation. Costs, weak savings, poor returns, bad timing, or some combination of all of it pushed him back into the labor market. Again, the issue is not whether work itself is noble. Work is often noble. The issue is whether the individual still controls the choice. That is what money is supposed to buy over time choice. If a person retires and then returns because boredom annoyed him, choice remains alive. If he returns because he cannot make the math work, then the math is governing him again. That is a very different emotional reality. A country with record numbers of people drawing from retirement plans early and record numbers of retirees. Returning to work for financial reasons is not enjoying deep household abundance, whatever official language may say. It is revealing stress in plain sight. Then there is the credit card. The credit card is perhaps the most honest small mirror in modern American finance. People can lie to themselves about many things. They can lie about whether a new car was deserved. They can lie about whether a bigger house was necessary. They can lie about whether a vacation was a bonding investment. They can lie about whether shopping was self-care. But once the balance starts rolling month to month at 20% interest or worse, the arithmetic begins telling the truth. Credit card balances are not necessarily proof of irresponsibility. Sometimes they are proof of gap filling. A household runs short. The card bridges the month, then the next month is short too. Now the bridge becomes a road, and at those interest rates, roads lead toward damage quickly. That is why I do not laugh when balances hit records. A record balance in a healthy environment can mean confidence. A record balance in a strained environment often means dependence. Dependence is the better word here. The consumer is not merely consuming. He is increasingly relying on borrowed continuity to preserve a lifestyle, or even a basic standard of functioning that current cash flow can no longer comfortably support. That is a dangerous condition. Dangerous not because it always ends tomorrow. Dangerous because once a household starts using expensive debt as a structural bridge rather than as a brief convenience, the future begins shrinking. The interest does not simply cost money. It steals room to save, room to invest, room to absorb the next problem, room to think. And once room disappears, every new shock lands harder. That is how ordinary people end up living one surprise away from humiliation, even while the macro story still sounds fairly upbeat. Now add delinquencies. Balances alone can be misread. Delinquencies are harder to misread. A delinquency is what happens when yesterday's spending reaches tomorrow, and tomorrow cannot pay for it. That is why the trend matters so much. A rising delinquency rate across major categories tells you the strain is not merely narrative. It is payment, level reality. Credit card delinquencies moving sharply higher matter, not because the number itself is the apocalypse, because the direction tells you who is losing control. And when student loan delinquencies look even worse, the picture gets darker. Student debt was sold to a generation as the future-building debt, the respectable debt, the debt attached to mobility, credentials, and upward movement. When even that debt begins falling badly behind, the proper question is not only whether the borrower made good choices, the deeper question is whether the economic structure waiting on the other side of those degrees and obligations is doing what was promised. A debt can be called an investment all day long. If the income path does not generate enough room after taxes and living costs, it will not feel like an investment to the person carrying it. It will feel like a permanent tax on adulthood. And that is exactly how millions of people live now. They are not simply paying for education. They are carrying yesterday's story about what education was supposed to guarantee into an economy that has become much harder to inhabit gracefully when total household delinquency rises quickly. I stopped caring so much about whether the current level is still below some famous historical catastrophe and start caring about the slope. The slope tells the truth. A body moving from health toward illness is not reassured by the sentence, "You have not yet reached organ failure." That is foolish reassurance. The fact that today is not yet 2008 or some other great financial trauma does not comfort me much if the broad trend is clearly deteriorating. The issue is not whether the disease has reached its final stage. The issue is whether it is spreading. And from what I can see, more households are falling behind in more categories at the same time. That is not random. That is structure talking. Now we come to the part where the public story and lived reality begin separating completely. We are told inflation is low. We are told unemployment is low. We are told wages are growing. We are told the labor market is resilient. We are told this is, in many ways, a strong economy. And yet, if the environment is so good, why are so many more people borrowing expensively, raiding retirement plans, missing payments, and going back to work after retirement? That contradiction is where serious thought should begin. I do not dismiss official data casually. That would be childish. I do, however, recognize that averages can miss the felt reality of households. A low reported inflation rate does not help much if the categories under sustained pressure are the exact categories most central to ordinary life: housing, insurance, food, healthcare, transportation, education, the things a family cannot easily opt out of. You can tell a household inflation is tame all you want. If it's rent, premiums, groceries, repairs, and debt service all moved faster than comfort, the household does not experience a tame inflation life. It experiences a squeezed life. That is what policymakers and economists too often miss. They describe the broad weather. Households live under the leaking part of the roof. The same is true of wages. A chart can say wages rose. That does not tell me how much discretion those wages created after the non-negotiables took their bite. The richer way to think about wages is not merely whether they rose in some average statistical sense. It is whether after taxes and after core living costs the household gained room. There is that word again. Did the family get more room? Did it gain more margin? If not, then nominal growth becomes a shallow comfort. And shallow comforts are exactly what modern economics too often sells. The labor market story is similar. A low unemployment rate sounds wonderful. Historically, yes. For something percent unemployment is not a depression level number, but numbers must be interpreted in context. If the labor market is this supposedly strong and the consumer is still this stressed, then something is wrong in the transmission. Either the jobs are weaker than the slogans suggest, or the wages are less powerful in real life than the official comparisons imply, or the cost structure of ordinary existence has drifted too far beyond what the median worker can comfortably carry. Likely some mixture of all three. That is why I do not find low unemployment alone particularly reassuring in this environment. A low unemployment rate cannot save a household whose paycheck does not create enough room. A job is not a moat. If the cost of living keeps outrunning the safety the job was supposed to provide. This is why the trend matters more than the headline: wage growth bending down, unemployment edging up, delinquencies rising, retirement withdrawals rising, retirees returning to work, credit balances swelling, student borrowers falling behind. These are not random dots scattered across unrelated pages. They are one story told in different dialects. The household is under pressure. Now, there can be temporary relief, a bigger tax refund, a policy adjustment, a one-time credit, a seasonal windfall. A refund absolutely helps. Of course it helps. If you are short on margin, any incoming cash feels like air, but one-time relief is not structural improvement. It is breathing room. Breathing room matters. Breathing room is not a cure. That is another distinction the culture resists because it wants quick rescue stories. A larger tax refund may help the consumer this season. That does not mean the underlying engine is healthy if by summer the same household is again leaning on cards, delaying payments, or staring at the retirement account as an emergency source. Temporary help is not durable repair. It is a pause, and the larger question is always why the pause was needed. This is where I eventually come back to a culprit I have distrusted for a very long time: the steady destruction of purchasing power through money creation and fiscal indiscipline. People prefer blaming the politician they already dislike. That is emotionally satisfying. I am more interested in the machine. Governments spend, central banks make excess spending easier to finance. The political class can promise, subsidize, paper over, and postpone because the monetary architecture allows it. The public then experiences the result not as a textbook chapter, but as a slow insult to everyday purchasing power. This is what inflation really is in lived terms. Not a statistic alone, a transfer, a silent tax, a way of telling the saver, the retiree, the fixed income household, and the careful family that prudence will now have to run faster simply to remain where it stood. That is what money printing does when stretched too far. It does not arrive in your life as a printing press. It arrives as the feeling that what used to be enough is no longer enough, even though you are not obviously living wildly. It arrives as the strange experience of doing everything more or less respectably and still feeling farther behind than the official narrative says you ought to feel. This is why I do not treat the central bank as some neutral weather pattern. It is part of the architecture. If politicians wish to spend beyond what the tax base can honestly support, and the monetary system repeatedly makes that easier, then eventually the household pays in reduced purchasing power, distorted asset prices, and a cost structure that no longer matches the assumptions by which ordinary people organize their lives. That is where we are. Now, I am not saying every household is doomed. I am not saying every chart points only toward ruin. The American consumer is resilient. I have immense respect for the work ethic, adaptability, and stubbornness of ordinary people. They will endure more than experts expect, but endurance should not be confused with health. A man can keep walking on a bad leg for longer than observers thought possible. That does not mean the leg is fine. This is where a lot of official commentary becomes dishonest. It sees continued spending and says the consumer is healthy maybe, or maybe the consumer is burning furniture to stay warm. Those are not the same thing. A household drawing from retirement, running card balances, falling behind on loans, and relying on temporary relief to remain current is not displaying deep economic health. It is displaying a willingness to keep functioning under worsening terms that is admirable in one sense. It is alarming in another as an investor, and more broadly as a student of human systems. I care much more about what is sustainable than about what is survivable for one more quarter. A household can survive ugly conditions for a while. What it cannot do indefinitely is survive rising non-negotiable costs, weakening wage momentum, growing debt burdens, and increasing financial stress without some larger adjustment. That adjustment comes one of three ways: costs fall, incomes rise faster and more broadly, or the household changes behavior through forced contraction at the moment. I do not see strong enough evidence that the first two are occurring at a scale sufficient to solve the third. That is why I think the next year could be harder than many people want to admit. If the labor market weakens even modestly from here while the consumer is already stretched, then the pleasant narrative about resilience will become much harder to sustain. It is one thing to be overextended when jobs feel secure. It is another thing entirely when the labor market begins wobbling and the household has already consumed its margin. That is what worries me most. Not the current picture alone, the current picture plus the direction. If this is what the consumer looks like while official unemployment is still low and inflation is still supposedly tame, then what happens if either number becomes materially less flattering? That is the right question, not whether today is technically fine compared to the worst moments of the past. What happens if the trend continues? I am not in the business of telling people to panic. Panic is expensive. What I do want is honesty. Honesty from policymakers would help, though I do not expect much of it. More importantly, honesty from households. If you are carrying toxic debt, call it toxic. If you are living without a margin of safety, call it what it is. If your wage growth has not truly outpaced your real cost of living, do not let some average national number bully you into doubting your own arithmetic. If the household feels squeezed, believe the squeeze, then do something about it. Cut fixed costs where you can. Stop adding lifestyle obligations just because the culture tells you that survival at your current level deserves to be rewarded with more obligations. Build cash reserves, protect retirement accounts, if at all possible. Avoid treating credit cards as income. Do not let temporary relief fool you into believing the structure is repaired. That is how adults behave in a tightening environment. They stop outsourcing judgment to slogans. The truth is that the American consumer is not one person. It is millions of balance sheets, millions of paychecks, millions of worries, millions of quiet substitutions and hidden trade-offs. What bothers me now is that too many of those private calculations appear to be moving the wrong way at the same time. That deserves respect. When enough households become fragile together, the macro story changes whether the politicians like it or not. And that is why I believe the financial health of the U.S. consumer is one of the most important stories in the country right now. Not because it is sensational, because it is foundational. You can lie for a while about confidence, you can spin employment, you can massage language, you can celebrate temporary checks and short-term spending bursts. What you cannot do forever is hide household strain once it begins showing up in withdrawals, delinquencies, and forced returns to the labor market. Those are not opinions. Those are behaviors, and behavior in finance is often the clearest truth available. If I had to reduce all of this to one line, it would be this. The American consumer is still carrying the economy, but he is carrying it with worse knees than the headlines admit. That is not an inspiring sentence. It may be a very accurate one. And accuracy is worth more to me than inspiration, because if we cannot tell the truth about the consumer, we will not tell the truth about the economy. And if we do not tell the truth about the economy, the adjustment will only become harsher when reality finally insists on being heard. That is what the numbers are trying to say. The question is whether we are willing to listen before the pain gets loud enough that listening is no longer optional.